are these people?
This next segment. So you and hopefully me, at least for a minute, will be planning to attend this watch on Washington, D.C. Coming up on Saturday.
Right.
We've seen, and everyone who's been on Twitter and anyone who has watched mainstream media knows that there's been a lot of protests regarding the Palestinian resistance, I will say, you know, for the last few weeks. There was a huge one in London, I believe it was last weekend. I can imagine this one in Washington will probably be just as or around as big. So you're going to this, Joe.
Yeah,
so,
just talk about the international support that we've seen so far for these protests. I know London had over 100,000 people. I know a couple of people that attended. There is a huge protest in Brussels, Belgium also. One of my good friends, my friend E.T., she is a student at a university in Leuven, Belgium. She's originally from Estonia. She attended the Brussels protest. There was a massive protest in Berlin, Germany over the weekend, but we didn't see much of a conversation about that in the mainstream legacy American media. There are protests taking place all over the world, especially in various parts of Europe, in support of Palestine. And I want to be clear when I say this. Just because you are pro-Palestine, that does not mean you are anti-Israel or anti-Israeli. I'm going to make sure that when I specifically say that, we pro-Palestine, we're pro-Palestine. Okay, fine. There are plenty of Israeli people that were also, Hamas also murdered a bunch of Israeli people. And that's not good either. There's no two ways of getting around that. We can't, if we're going to go ahead and admonish what Israel has done to Palestine, we must also admonish what Hamas did to innocent Israelis, because every life is supposed to be important. We're not placing one life over another. I don't want to do that, because if we do that, then we end up with these asymmetrical arguments about everything, and it just gets too convoluted. And I'm trying to make sure I simplify all of this as much as possible.
Well,
even though
it's complicated.
That's
like with that,
it is.
Every Israeli citizen has to be a part of what, Joe?
The United States military, not the United States military, the Israeli military. Yes.
So we can claim those were all innocent civilians, yet all of them spent time in the IDF and probably still, you know, and this is on top of, there's a lot of propaganda surrounding that whole event to begin with. Hamas says they didn't target civilians, you know, that this was crossfire situations and Israel making it bigger than it was. And, you know, we also know Israel has been known to make false flags. If you look at the Lavon affair, if you look at, you know, there's a lot surrounding all this. So I get you. Innocent loss of life sucks regardless.
Right.
You know,
but I think innocent loss of life sucks on either side. That being said,
do I understand?
That's what I'm getting at. Yes.
And this
the need to like fight the oppressor in any means necessary, like kinda, you know, like you've spent since 1948, innocent lives of Palestinians have been lost and lost again and lost some more. So, you know, do I think eye for an eye is worth it? No, but you know.
But this is what I was saying earlier.
Yeah.
In terms of your interview with Ben. And we experienced this as international Black men. Like, in terms of...
I already know where you're going with this.
ADOS and FBAs view us.
Yes.
Like, we have... There's kind of like this internal struggle among us that we need to kind of deal with.
Correct.
And so along with that, there needs to be a serious conversation with Western Jewish people. Now, and I've seen, and I've talked to, like, as I said, I've been talking to Indy. I also know a few people who are Jewish that might sympathize with the Palestinian struggle.
Oh, here you go. I got you. I got exactly what you're about to say. Hold on. Let's bring.
I'd rather you not say
terrorist organization.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I have this from everyone's favorite bean pie supporter, Malcolm X,
Right.
when he was asked about the Mau Mau terrorists in Kenya.
Well, this was a terrorist organization that didn't just defend themselves from specific acts, but initiated acts of terrorism. Do you favor that in this country?
No, I think that the conditions that prevailed in Kenya forced the Mau Mau to take action. And any action that they took, even though it seemed that they were initiating it, actually it was a defensive action. And it was a reaction to the colonial powers that were exploiting them.
But do you favor such an organization here?
Does white America favor the Ku Klux Klan or the Citizens Council? And as long as the government, police bodies, do nothing about the existence of white terror groups that are terrorizing blacks, then it's time for blacks to do whatever is necessary to put these white terror groups in their place. And I feel that a Mau Mau could wipe out the Klan in the north, south, east, and west, and wherever it exists. I'm not against the idea at all.
Well, this was a...
So... You know,
I mean, so, but given that, what Malcolm X said in the past, the conversation needs to be had, in my opinion, among Western Jews who, and I've seen a few online, and I get how you need to kind of show solidarity with Israelis who you share a faith and you share a culture with in terms of your religion. I totally get that. And I understand that. That being said, if you cannot speak in truth, and I'm saying this to, well, I've seen a lot of, Jews here who have been pro-Palestine who have been very outspoken about this. So
arrested,
I'm not talking
censored,
right.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people who might know, who are very aware of how Zionism has used their faith as a vehicle to justify the current genocide of an indigenous group in the Near East, and are not willing to elevate that conversation so that there can be a little bit more understanding, and I would argue more solidarity among themselves in terms of how to move forward and deal with this reality. I think it's going to be a tough conversation. Yes, it will. But I think at this point, it's a conversation that needs to be had. And for me, and it's the argument of, and I think a lot of people are saying, to me now, like, oh, we feel like we supported you guys, the Black people, during George Floyd or whatever else. You're not supporting us now. And no, it's not that we're not supporting you. It's the idea of people are against capitalism. We're against colonialism. We're against the very system that would cause an uprising like this. And as Kwame Ture said, and I played a clip from him several weeks ago, where I think it might have been a Jewish heckle or whatever, but he said to that person, if I am a slaveholder and you're the slave, and your means to freedom is to kill me, would you do it? Like, so the question is, yeah, I think the idea of, yes, it's horrible to see bloodshed on both sides. However, there's a narrative that's being pushed mostly in mainstream media, that it's one-sided over the other.
It tends to be one-sided. It's just not the side they want to portray it as.
Right. And the issue that I have is, I think the main thing, if we want to keep it simple, who controls the resources? It's not Palestinians.
No.
And it's not even Hamas. They're a resistance group. It's the Israeli government with our funding, as you said, with our tax dollars. And I'll make this argument, especially for the FBAs. I said this before, the FBAs and ADOs who are like, oh, that's their fight. We have nothing to do with it. Your tax dollars.
Yeah, similar
instead
to
of giving reparations
Al-Qaeda,
to you,
ISIS, the
your
Viet
tax
Cong.
dollars that could be going towards student loan debt is going towards the occupation. Your tax dollars that could be cleaning up our schools is going to Israel military. Your tax dollars that is paying for their universal health care, right? To be damned that we can get universal health care here, but Israel has universal health care on our dime. So,
in an Iron Dome on our dime, Israel wouldn't be capable of defending itself without us.
Right. Which is why even in this, I hate the idea of ceasefire to me, like this narrative of like, yes, I want it to stop. But the question I'm asking is, if you stop it, then what happens? Number one, what do the terms of a ceasefire look like?
Right.
And I will say, according to the West, are you willing to cut aid to Israel in order to get that? I haven't heard of anything of the sort at this point. So it's more control of the narrative. And I think that's something that we also have to push back on in terms of like, and I think even this weekend, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion of, yes, we need a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. But ceasefire to me means nothing if it means continuing to fund Israel for potentially continuing this war, and then humanitarian aid that, and I'm going to say allegedly, that's supposed to go to Israel. How do we know that it's going to go to them? How do we know that it's going to go, like in Gaza, like everything is kind of locked up. And we've talked about this on the show before, like, the Israeli government basically is in control of anything that goes in or out of Gaza. So how do we know for sure that they're actually the military aid that, Biden is saying that we need to give is actually going to go to the civilians?
Dude, how can you give military aid to Israel, which is bombing Palestinians outright, carpet bombing them right now? They're literally, they talk about mowing the lawn. They are completely wiping out the West Bank as we speak, right? And you're going to give them water and a Band-Aid? That's what you think is the solution? Like, that you can somehow do both? It's like, I'm going to pay the bully to give them baseball bats, but I'm going to give you a juice box at least. Like, what? How does that work?
Right.
Anyway, Joe, I feel like you've been loading up some words. So
I'll just end this here. Like, I just think in terms of our experience within the Black struggle, in terms of it's very much parallel to what we experienced.
Absolutely.
And continue to experience here. And so for me, it's like, this is how I think about it in terms of us. Like, if this were us and we're calling for like, a ceasefire, who is making the demands? I would hope that would be us, in order to kind of say, these are the stipulations that we want in order for this to stop, in order, so, and I don't necessarily hear that conversation being had in terms of the Palestinians. Like, we know what they want. Well, like we've been talking about independent media. I haven't necessarily heard, from mainstream media, like, what are the Palestinians looking for? Or hell, like, what is Hamas looking for? And the reality is there have been ceasefires in the past. This is not the first time, but Israel basically flipped them off and like, nah, we're good. We're going to continue to bomb your asses because we want to occupy the remaining what remains of Israel. So no, it's like, do we want this result? Absolutely not. But in my mind, I understand why. And I get what you're saying, Joe, in terms of like both sides. But to me, Israel, by way of us, are more at fault. And there's a lot that we need to be accountable for. And that's what people are protesting. And I think at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's not so much Palestine. I would argue it's more our government, as you were saying, that is continuing to fund this war that we didn't ask for, to continue the genocide of another people group that, especially if you're a person of color, we get it.
And the idea that they've made this Israel versus Hamas, but that's not even the case with Israel. Israel is more, they're throwing bombs at Syria, at Yemen, at Egypt, at, like, they're acting like they're the victim here, and clearly they're the ones throwing all the punches,
Right.
But
like,
Joe, feel free, and then I got a couple more videos after that. But
right,
go ahead.
Right, and this is and thank you, gentlemen. I mean, this is exactly why I tweeted what I tweeted the other day, and I said, just asking for a ceasefire is not enough, because what we've heard over the past few weeks, and we've heard this regarding the creation of the United Nations, is we're never going to have a situation like this ever again. We're never going to have a genocide like this, and we're creating the United Nations. So there is some diplomacy, there's a spirit of conviviality and humanitarianism. So these sorts of human catastrophes never happen again, but we're seeing it happen now. And a ceasefire is not going to be enough, because if everybody just calls for a ceasefire, what happens in 2 weeks? What happens in 3 weeks? What happens what happens later on this year when this flares up again? And it most likely will, because that's what it's always been doing. We need to have a strategic plan. And I'm not a diplomat by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just a DJ that maybe has a little bit more common sense and can look at something from multiple points of view. And the 4 points of view: macro, micro, bird's eye, and nonlinear. I can see things from various perspectives and synthesize all this information to make it make sense. The first thing we need to do is somehow end Israel's occupation of Palestine. We also need to end USA's financial aid to Israel. And this is $3.8 billion a year, every year until 2026. And if you think $3.8 billion a year is a lot of money, that pales in comparison to the New York City Police Department budget, which is $10.8 billion a year. So the United States sends $3.8 billion.
Many of those cops are trained by who?
Yep.
IDF.
Another reason for Black people to care. Because when they beat them up, when they beat our asses up,
and also
you can thank
and also
for that.
And also, I want to talk about this before we get off the subject. Brazil, who a lot of you, especially the Bolsonaro ones, are more than willing to support Israel right now. And that's mainly because you also go train the IDF. And you get training from the IDF. Like, I know you Gracies are running around. I see you out there. Like, y'all talk about police reform, and yet, you know, meanwhile, like Rio is one of the most like wealth gapped cities in the world. You know, like the barrios are pretty crazy. I don't know if you've noticed, you know. But anyway, Joe,
the New York City Police Department, again, $10.8 billion per year budget. By the way, the New York City Police Department has 16 satellite offices in 12 different countries. One of their satellite offices is in Tel Aviv, Israel.
The NYPD has straight up office in Israel. You know,
if you think $3.8 billion a year in military aid to a country is a lot of money, remember the New York City Police Department. Just keep that in mind. We also need, in terms of just when we march, at least what I'm going to be marching for, is an immediate release of all hostages on both sides of the border. Immediate release of all hostages. These hostages are innocent people. They had nothing to do with this. Let the hostages go. Let them go. Obviously, an immediate ceasefire, immediate humanitarian aid, and this includes medical care. This includes water, fuel, and electricity. We also need a reconnection of all communication networks in the Gaza Strip. Collin, you just said we don't know anything about what the Palestinians want, and we don't know what Hamas's demands are. Well, it's difficult to know what a group of people want when the communications networks where they are is cut
off.
So you can't have a conversation with somebody that doesn't have any way to speak to you. Right. So reconnecting the communication networks in the Gaza Strip would be a great way to facilitate some sort of conversations and negotiations. Obviously, especially when we have hostages involved. This next point is going to be the most difficult. We need to find some way where Palestinians and Israelis can peacefully coexist. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how to figure that out.
But I think even with that, pause for 1 second. I think even with that, as I said, there needs to be an account of the history that surrounds both groups.
Yeah, secular Palestine seemed to have managed.
I would argue goes even past within the last 100 years. This is, I would argue, a thousands year issue. Yeah. I would argue if you're looking at it from the biblical standpoint, you know, this has been an issue from the time of, you know, Abraham.
Well, and that's part of the problem. There's no need for a religious state in this area. Secular Palestine seemed to manage with Jewish people just fine. So
right, but regardless,
I say the same about the Vatican. I don't need that. Right. Rome can own that, you know.
Right.
Like,
but regardless, in terms of like, let's talk about the Holocaust for a second. Every Jewish person, look, hell, we learned the Holocaust in school, you know. Who in the chat had to read Night by Elie Wiesel at some point in your school career?
Yeah.
Like, I had to read that in middle school, you know. Like, Jewish people do not let us forget about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
You know, and for a right reason. So in that same vein, you should be willing to have those discussions among yourselves.
Well, Collin,
in terms of how
You sound like a particular Democrat from 10 years ago. This guy, 10 years ago, Collin. 10. Wait, don't mute me.
Their right to justice must. Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their right to justice, must also be recognized. And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own, living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. It's not just when settler violence against Palestinians goes unpunished. It's not right to prevent Palestinians from farming their lands or restricting a student's ability to move around the West Bank or displace Palestinian families from their homes. Neither occupation nor expulsion is the answer. Just as Israelis built a state in their homeland, Palestinians have a right to be a free people in their own land.
10 years ago. What happened? What happened? How do we end up to this other Democrat lady? Oh, wait, this is the wrong photo. Where's it at? You have this lady. How do we end up here?
People who are calling for a ceasefire now do not understand Hamas. That is not possible. It would be such a gift to Hamas because they would spend whatever time there was a ceasefire in effect rebuilding their armaments, creating stronger positions to be able to fend off an eventual assault by the Israelis. So we're in a very different world. I don't think it had to be the world we're in, but that's where we are, and we've got to figure our way forward through it.
I mean, straight up, essentially saying we can't have a ceasefire.
Right.
Which is, that's already half a breadcrumb. But
regardless, what I do think needs to happen, there needs to be talks among Israelis and Jews in terms of the history that will be a tough conversation to be had. But in the same way that we have to have those conversations among ourselves within the Black community, given our history and our link to Africa and how, and again, the key word is colonialism really warped our thinking towards each other. The same needs to be had among Israelis and Jews in terms of the history and the colonization that surrounds them and how that has affected, not just Palestinians, but I would argue just the Middle East in general. So until that happens, the idea of a two-state, one-state solution, I don't think is possible.
Yeah.
Because there's still going to be this propaganda that still exists in terms of,
like with what Hillary said, she was talking about Hamas and a ceasefire, and they still, what about Israel, who commits war crimes during ceasefires? Like, they also are, it's like you're wanting to both sides stuff, but then you don't both sides the stuff. It's very weird,
Right. So,
like,
I just think, so I think that's the part that is missing in my mind in this whole conversation. And I think it's great that we're having this here, but it needs to be happening more.
Saturday. Right, at the Freedom Plaza as well.
And you know what though? But even with this though, and I was speaking to a mutual friend who's in Europe today, asked me if I was going to go, and I shared with him. And look, point blank, and I've said this on the show before, protests and standing your ground and making your voices known, I think ultimately, on a very basic level, I think is a good thing. I think it's a necessary thing. And I do encourage people, especially if you're able to go to this or other, demonstrations throughout the country. If you have the opportunity to go, do it. That being said, I am always skeptical I think in our generation, in terms of having these protests and demonstrations without talking about what type of actionable steps can be taken after. It's one thing just to go and hear a couple of great speeches and get all fired up.
Yeah.
But then go home and what changes?
And don't internalize that conversation.
Right. And this kind of goes to Biden. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of people who are going to cuss out the American government over the weekend, and rightly so. But in a year from now, what will that translate to? Will that translate into, actually possibly withholding your vote for the duopoly? Will that translate you? Hold on. Will that translate you into actually taking some sort of direct action, towards this locally for you? Or are you just going to fall under the spell of the duopoly and basically be like, assuming that it's Trump who's going to be the nominee, Biden's going to be the nominee, that it's going to be like, oh, well, I totally understand this issue, but, that's my concern. If anything, in a way, what's happening is happening too soon. This would be a lot more interesting if this were happening this time next year, because I think it would give more people pause and actually, in my mind, be more willing to actually do some sort of direct action or be willing to withhold their vote. That's just in my opinion, just thinking about it. That being said, this is a year from now, and we don't know what's going to happen within the next few months that people are going to forget, or mainstream media is not going to cover this as much. I could imagine that this situation is going to be, I wouldn't say buried, but you talk about it less. There's going to be something else that will come up on the pipeline. People are going to forget. And when it comes to voting time, again, it's the idea of like, Biden, Trump, well, the powers that be tell me that Trump is bad. And even though Biden didn't do any of what he promised he would do for the working class, he's still, people are going to go in pretzels to kind of justify the idea of voting for either one.
Yeah.
I agree. I thoroughly agree. And Collin, I agree with you with what you just said about a minute and a half, 2 minutes ago. This protest would have been more effective, I don't know, about 10 or 11 months from now. But I think this protest would have been more effective maybe 2 or 3 or 6 months ago. You mentioned the words direct action. What have I constantly talked about anytime I've been a guest on this show? I've always talked about intra-industry and inter-industry labor strikes.
Mm-hmm.
If you tied this protest to a labor strike,
right?
For example, the United Auto Workers in Detroit, or UPS strike, UPS drivers,
Starbucks, or the railroad, or the Starbucks,
McDonald's,
Amazon,
and a lot of those people now that pro-Palestine are getting fired.
Yeah, well, so, or Starbucks is saying you literally can't have Starbucks in your union name because you're pro-Palestine and we're pro-Israel and you're using our likeness. So yada yada. But
a labor strike with this protest would have been highly effective. But Collin, I do agree with you. We do need to protest. We do need to make our voices heard, but there must be more than just calling for a ceasefire without any actionable items after that. And some of the other actionable items that I wanted to continue to discuss is something that we're seeing a lot more of on both sides, and we have to denounce it on both sides because it's wrong.
Right.
We have to unequivocally reject anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because discriminating against somebody because of their religious affiliation is wrong, regardless of what side it's on. So if it's wrong. It's
right.
wrong.
But
keep in mind, Palestinians are Semitic,
Right.
So
I think we need to hear from Palestinians.
Yeah, a lot more.
What they want, what their demands are, and good luck trying to find that. As you said, their quality of life is essentially cut off. So their voices are not being heard right now. So that's who I'm more interested to hear from is what are your demands in terms of having, if a ceasefire were to exist, and if you are able to come to the negotiating table, what do you want people to know? What do you want? What are your demands? And I think if I would feel a lot better in that regard if that is what is offered. But I almost feel like they're using the ceasefire in terms of military humanitarian aid as a carrot, almost.
Yeah.
In a sense of, we want to have the ceasefire in order to, in the means to give you this aid. So you give them the aid, allegedly, then what? You're gonna wrap up. You're still funding Israel, so you give them the aid for, as you said, Joe, like will last what, 2 weeks, a month, couple of months, and then after that, when that's all run out, what is Israel going to do? Are they going to continue wrapping up the bombing Gaza and the West Bank? So these are the kind of discussions, and I will hope that at this protest, we will get to hear some more of this. Hopefully, I'm a little more cynical about these things at this point. Don't think we're necessarily going to hear that, but ideally, these are the conversations moving forward that I think, especially in independent media, that we should be having.
Well,
I agree.
I found this.
We
real quick before we close this out. And I think it speaks to the conversation that you're talking about.
I want y'all to be perfectly aware of something. When you see Biden start walking back his statements being like, oh, actually, Palestinians don't deserve to be slaughtered en masse in an open air prison. When you see that shit, know that the Democratic Party is absolutely fucking scrambling over this. They have access to data and analytics on shit that you never even would think to track and have data on. They have access to that, and they have people with doctorates poring over all that, and they are seeing that the old guard shock and awe tactics that manufactured consent from Iraq aren't fucking working on the demographics that they want it to work on. Oh shit, my phone. Because look, I lived through the invasion of Iraq and then the expanding to Afghanistan. I was young, but I do remember how it was. There were protests at that time, massive worldwide protests against the invasion of Iraq. People knew that shit was wrong from the jump, but because the social media wasn't what it was now, they could control that narrative. They could paint Saddam Hussein as the ultimate evil, the way that they're doing to Hamas, and manufacture consent to drown out those voices, to make those people protesting look like bleeding heart liberals who don't really love their country in the wake of an awful terrorist attack. That's what they managed to do back then. They think it's going to work now. That's why you saw that huge, over-the-top, loud propaganda push on New York Times, Washington Post, NBC News, AP News, Reuters, all of it. That's why you saw that. That's why Israel paid that money for those just psychopathic, like, kitty ads to be played on YouTube. They think because they're all, like, have a median age of 89 years old, they think that that can still work. They think that that can still work. So it's not a testament to y'all's media literacy, because we all know that that's in the gutter. It's a testament to the fact that these people are able to directly share their stories and make their suffering inignorable. I have never in my life seen such a dramatic flip within a month on any invasion. I promise you that. And trust and believe, Biden and his team think that they are fucked. They do. They just outright think that they're fucked over this, because historically, starting a war is the easiest way for an American president to get reelected without changing any bit of their policy. If you bungle every aspect of your presidency but start a war, historically, like, patriotism will just wipe all that from the populace's mind, and they will rally behind the incumbent president because they want that stability to lead them through the war. Biden is seeing Israel escalate their genocide against Palestine into a regional war, is making preparations to engage in that war, and is not seeing the public support. They're seeing people, like, read their propaganda and choose to listen to the people that they were hoping would be sufficiently dehumanized. They're scared. Like that thing I said about numbers earlier, they have access to the polling numbers right now. They see that Trump is doubling their polls. They're probably worse than what we know. Like, Biden's re-election campaign is beyond fucked by this, and they know it. So that's why he's starting to, like, softball a bit, walk it back, and then insidiously start to cast doubt on Palestinian casualties, so he can say, oh, well, Palestinians deserve dignity, but also the terrorists were lying the whole time, so they can maintain that Israel has the right to defend itself and boost our weapons contractors. And maybe we shouldn't be calling for the wholesale collective punishment, because people kind of know what that means by now. Like, they're scrambling. They're just scrambling. They're not walking it back because they're too prideful and evil and cocky to walk it back. But they're absolutely seeing grifters like what the fuck is that name? That Hinkle dude and Censored Men and all these, like, MAGAs with American flags in their bios successfully pivot to championing Palestine and getting mass support and, like, boosting and, like, raising their profiles off it. They are seeing that the same way that we're seeing that. They're seeing that even more, and they are realizing that the hardline stance that they are forced to take is absolutely torching their careers. They know it. Just don't let them forget it, because they want you.
Closing thoughts, gentlemen.
Wow. Preach.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, and again, she kind of spoke to your experience, Joe. Again, like, the narrative isn't working in mainstream, like, especially among young people. Like, people have been educated even on a basic level about the reality regarding this conflict, and I'm not buying it. But more importantly, they're making the connection of, this is our doing. Like, the blood is on our hands. That's been on our hands, but more so now. So again, it's the question of, and this is what and I will say this, because I said it already, like, I don't want to hear, I don't think this is going to happen, but I'm still traumatized from George Floyd protests of how Black people were like, we need to vote for Biden. Don't think that's going to happen this time. But again, we're a year out.
Yeah.
So a lot can happen between now and this time next year that people are going to potentially forget. And I'm glad that you've been here to kind of give the breakdown of Biden. And what we're going to do is clip that shit up and kind of post it every few weeks as a reminder to be like, this is what DJ Joe Nice said in our show. So you need to pay attention and think about this when you're ready to vote come next summer, early next fall.
And also stop censoring Palestinian voices. As a DJ, I'm sure he recognizes Low Key, DJ Abdul. There's a load of groups over there that are being actively censored on Spotify and so many other platforms. I mean, we've been censored. It's ridiculous. But yeah, Joe, please.
Yeah, there's a couple more points that I wanted to talk about regarding what I hope is part of a larger discussion and conversation this Saturday regarding the protests. Talked about an unequivocal condemnation and or rejection of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. What also needs to happen is war crimes tribunals at the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands for anyone involved in the murder of innocent civilians. And again, this involves Hamas, this involves the Israeli Defense Forces, and anybody providing military support for this war. We can't say that people are committing war crimes and have these crimes go unpunished.
Right.
One more time with that. We can't say that people are committing war crimes and have these crimes go unpunished. There are plenty of war criminals that came from the former Yugoslavia. Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, Franjo Tudjman, who became the first president of Croatia, and the airport in Zagreb, Croatia is named after him. There were some evil people that were involved in what happened in Srebrenica in Bosnia, in the murdering of 3,000 Bosniaks. These are war criminals. This is no different than what we're seeing right now in the Middle East, in Israel and in Palestine. Anybody involved in killing anybody that was innocent, members of the press, innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, hospital workers, etc. Anybody involved in killing anybody that was innocent must face a tribunal, a war crimes tribunal. Has to happen. It has to happen. And the last point that I wanted to make, and this reverts back to the previous segment, I want immediate resignations of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Anthony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Avril Haines, and any member of Congress that's supporting this war. They all have to go, because you can't trust any of these people. You can't trust any of them. All of them have to go. I want all of them out. All of them. In fact, if we can have a complete reboot of Congress, all 538 members of Congress, I'm fully in favor of that.
No, we can do a couple better. We need to just reboot government, just the whole thing, just on the very basis of what it's been built on. Needs to be just go.
Like, which is exactly what I talked. And I talked about that earlier on when I said we need a cultural autopsy. And we need to reform all of the institutions that make up a society. And I said one of the institutions is government. We need to look at that. And if we're going to look at reforming government, what we also need to do is examine the United States Constitution and rewrite that and revise that, because the United States Constitution is the founding government of the U.S. It's essentially, let me use this analogy, it's essentially the software for our government. It's the software for our government. We have phones. We have computers. They go through software updates to make sure that they're working at optimal efficiency. We have a document that was written in 1789, and sure, we've had 27 changes of that document, but it hasn't had. But the fundamental amendments of the Constitution are really the first 15 amendments, the first half. They haven't really been changed since 1865. That's a problem. That's a huge problem, and that needs to change. So we might need to look into rewriting the United States Constitution. That way we can reform one of the institutions that makes up a society, government. But in lieu of that, the immediate resignations of Biden, Harris, Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Avril Haines, and any member of Congress supporting this war has to happen.
Yep.
Because like I said in the interview that I did with Ben Bergquam from Real Voices America, our tax dollars shouldn't be paying for this.
Right.
Especially $100 billion paying for this war.
And Ukraine.
And Ukraine. We have other issues in this country that, quite frankly, are more pressing. And I'm not saying that the life of an innocent Israeli or an innocent Palestinian is not important. I'm not saying that at all. But we shouldn't be funding anybody's wars. Anybody's wars. We should be minding our own business and taking care of business here at home. We shouldn't be playing away games.
The French designed a reset button. You put two posts up, sharp thing in the middle. But I digress.